I'm your reflector. I'm going to turn my camera off so I can focus on my words. Okay. I've been reflecting on ICUJP, reflecting on our name, Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace. And I've been reflecting on our motto or slogan, message to the world: religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. And I'm wondering if the title of our organization and the slogan we put out there are sometimes at odds with each other. I don't know who all the founders of ICUJP were. I came late to the group. I know Regis, Bierman, and Hatut are mentioned a lot, but I'm sure there were other people who sat with the three of them and talked about what they were going to call this organization: Interfaith Communities United, Jew, Christian, Muslim, United. United for what? Peace. Okay. What about peace and justice? Okay. And then somebody pipes up, why not justice and peace? And I guess everybody finally agreed. Justice and peace. United for justice and peace. Why did they put the word justice before the word peace? Right around that same time, they came up with this slogan, motto for the group: religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. And if you push that message further out beyond religious communities, you're saying to everybody in the country, stop making war, stop doing violence. But what about that word justice? It's not there in our slogan. So did ICUJP's founders think we could have justice and peace at the same time? Or did they put justice before peace because they thought you can't have real peace until you have justice? In 1992, I was marching across the street from the Parker Center, the headquarters of LAPD, marching in protest of the Rodney King verdict. And I heard a chant that I had never heard before: no justice, no peace. So there's this push-pull thing in my head. How do you balance that desire, that wish for peace? How do you balance that with God's demand for justice? God's command to do justice, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And God can be whatever you want: some higher power, some force greater, bigger than our individual selves, some force, power greater than me. Is peace always the number one priority? Were the people of Vietnam and El Salvador and Nicaragua supposed to live out their miserable lives peacefully, passively, non-violently, waiting for their oppressors to grant them justice? Is the rule in our slogan, the rule against war and violence, is that rule absolute? Justice and peace. Martin Luther King wrote from the Birmingham jail, justice too long delayed is justice denied. And on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King put his life on the line to declare the evil of the U.S. war against Vietnam. And Dr. King mentioned the National Liberation Front of Vietnam, but he did not condemn the National Liberation Front for taking up arms to fight for freedom and justice. If we agree to this slogan of ours, to stop waging war and stop using violence, are we entitled then to sit in judgment of people like Tecumseh and Sitting Bull and Geronimo, like John Brown, the Union soldiers in the Civil War, like the African Americans who took up arms against white terrorist rule after Reconstruction failed, like Filipino natives who resisted occupation by the U.S. military, like Augusto Sandino, who rebelled using violence against the Nicaraguan oligarchy and the U.S. Marines, Russian soldiers and American soldiers who fought the Nazis in World War II, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara. Am I entitled to judge? So I guess what this reflection comes down to is me confessing that I'm not a pacifist, but still thinking I might be a fit for interfaith communities united for A, justice, and B, peace. That's all I got. Thanks for indulging me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave. That was very thoughtful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna say a couple things. Someone asked about Carol Francis asked about next Friday's forum. We're going to hear from a group called icar.org, which is Rabbi Sharon Bruce, a very interesting organization in Los Angeles that's doing a lot of work around peace and justice in the community, and working with a lot of programs in Los Angeles. So that's one thing that's going. In the chat, I put, and I'll put our link tree again, because I guess, yeah, the previous discussion doesn't show up until you come to the chat. So this is our link tree for ICUJP, and it has information to go to the website, go to donate as well. You can get a lovely ICUJP t-shirt there that, even though I've worn it, it's actually very fashionable. And you can also find out about some of the work that the authors and directors that have spoken to us in previous YouTube videos have talked about as well. And there's a link in there to go to our YouTube channel and find out about any of the recordings that you might have missed. So that makes for a lovely weekend of watching. So, yep, if you can take a look there, that'd be great.
Rick is a Bible scholar. He studied at San Francisco Theology School. He is a lieutenant colonel, and I'm sure he could fill in the blanks what I don't know. But he's a lifelong Christian Scientist, and he has a lot of experience and a lot of Bible knowledge and stories and wonderful things he's going to tell us. Rick, take it away, or it's your takeaway.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you all for inviting me. I'm trying very hard to think of how I can best make bridges to the justice and peace issues you're so invested in. And it's hard sometimes to look at how, as I have been for much of my career, someone who is on the inside of an institution like the military can also be in it without being of it. And how do you bring prophetic witness to difficult circumstances. I will say that one thing that should come across, I hope, in my remarks is there's a lot to be done from the inside. In fact, there's kind of an old adage that the only way you can get dents out of a can is from the inside. And so you want people on the inside. The Bible gives us a bit of a challenge with that, because in Jewish scriptures, being a prophet was not a desirable term in many cases. Prophets like Jeremiah didn't really want to be called one. And a lot of them were hacks hired by the king to tell him what he wanted to hear. So one of the challenges is, can we be authentic and still be involved? And the reason we're involved, many of us who are in the chaplaincy, all of us, I think, in the chaplaincy, is because we feel ourselves ministering to God's people. And the term for interspirituality, one of them that's being used by a professional organization, Rick can put this in the chat box, is Spiritual Companions, SDIcompanions.org. And it's a professional organization that has people of all faiths that are talking about how they help people with what they sometimes refer to the psychology of the soul. Interspirituality as the psychology of the soul. This has grown out of a long tradition in the Roman Catholic Church of spiritual directors. Now that has seemed to be, for a larger audience, a little challenging, as it doesn't really mean what spiritual directors do. It's not telling people what to do. And so Spiritual Companions has been a modification of SDI. It's a good website. They have some upcoming talks. One, October 25th, is on interfaith and interspiritual fluency for spiritual companions. It's a resource, interspirituality is, to talk about how do you go beyond agreeing to belief systems, organized religion, hierarchies. Is it really about what you believe, or is it about what you've experienced? And that's part of the national dialogue right now about a lot of people who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And we'll talk a bit about that. I'm also just going to make it personal, because I think that's what you wanted. I don't want to do a lot of head stuff. I want to talk and share some heart stuff of my journey, and hopefully in the conversation of questions and answers, we can pick that up some. I've been thinking about you a lot for the last couple of weeks. And 36 hours ago, almost exactly, I was in a hospice wing of a VA hospital in Dallas, Texas. A dear friend and colleague of mine who'd been a big supporter of the nonprofit I started after I got out of the military. And a person in the forefront of the green and environmental movement was near death. And I was there. He's a Christian Scientist. I'm a Christian Scientist. And my partner in the nonprofit was also there. She had come down by car from Denver. I'd flown out from California. And we were struck sometimes, like most religions have not done a lot of work with what happens when you're trying to minister to somebody who can't really see, can't really hear, can't communicate verbally. What is it like for a theology of the disabled? One friend of mine, a woman who, Baptist, a woman who is one of the leading John scholars, the Gospel of John in the U.S., did some work on this a while back and shared with me how oftentimes we've been trite in dealing with people who are having disability issues. She said one individual who was in a wheelchair was being told by a number of people, well, when you get to heaven, you can go run like all the other people. And her reflection was, Really? How do we know what heaven's going to look like for that person? Maybe heaven for that person will be a place without curbs. Trying to think differently about people we've known is kind of interesting. I'm going to start off with a little sample of something that I've used with a couple of groups that this friend I told you about, the Baptist woman teaching New Testament at a seminary in Dallas, shared with me. It helped me as I keep thinking of new ways we are doing spiritual connection. As my friend and I anointed the feet of our friend who is in the hospital bed in hospice, we were just holding his feet. She can't feel anything. She's my friend, she's a quadriplegic, but she asked that her hand be placed on his, and I was anointing with sandalwood oil. It was a very moving time, and we could see tears forming in the eyes of the man we were caring for. But I'm going to play another piece for you too, something that we have from the gospel of Jesus encountering a woman with emotional disabilities, the woman at the well in Samaria. And it's pretty powerful. Remember, to the Jewish audience, the Samaritans were not the good people, and she was an outcast gender in that group, and she was outcast among the women. That's why she came to the well at the middle of the day rather than with the other women. An outcast woman of an outcast gender, of an outcast people, and she is the first one Jesus tells his mission to in the Gospel of John. And Jesus might have prayed and thought a lot of affirmations, I'm sure he did, as to how he saw this woman, but the main thing was he let her be seen. And Rick, if you would, could you play the little piece?
I am a woman of no distinction, of little importance. I am a woman of no reputation save that which is bad. You whisper as I pass by and cast judgmental glances, though you don't really take the time to look at me or even get to know me. For to be known is to be loved, and to be loved is to be known, and otherwise what's the point in doing either one of them in the first place? I want to be known. I want someone to look at my face and not just see 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, and 2 ears, but to see all that I am and could be, all my hopes, loves, and fears. But that's too much to hope for, to wish for, or pray for, so I don't, not anymore. Now I keep to myself, and by that I mean the pain that keeps me in my own private jail, the pain that's brought me here at midday to this well. To ask for a drink is no big request, but to ask it of me, a woman unclean, ashamed, used and abused, an outcast, a failure, a disappointment, a sinner. No drink passing from these hands to your lips could ever be refreshing, only condemning, as I'm sure you condemn me now, but you don't. You're a man of no distinction, though of the utmost importance, a man with little reputation, at least so far. You whisper and tell me to my face what all those glances have been about, and you take the time to really look at me, but don't need to get to know me, for to be known is to be loved, and to be loved is to be known. And you know me. You actually know me, all of me and everything about me, every thought inside and hair on top of my head, every hurt stored up, every hope, every dread, my past and my future, all I am and could be. You tell me everything. You tell me about me. And that which is spoken by another would bring hate and condemnation. Coming from you brings love, grace, mercy, hope, and salvation. I've heard of one to come who would save a wretch like me, and here in my presence you say, I am he. To be known is to be loved, and to be loved is to be known. And I just met you, but I love you. I don't know you, but I want to get to. Let me run back to town. This is way too much for just me. There are others, brothers, sisters, lovers, haters, the good and the bad, sinners and saints, who should hear what you've told me, who should see what you've shown me, who should taste what you gave me, who should feel how you forgave me. For to be known is to be loved, and to be loved is to be known. And they all need this too. We all do need it for our own.
Today, we are in such need of following the major line in that slam piece, slam poetry. To be known is to be loved is to be known. Everybody wants to be seen. Black lives matter, blue lives matter. Me Too matters. Everybody wants to be seen and not judged. I love the cutting edge people like Abraham X. Kendi, who are writing that the opposite of racist isn't not racist. There's no neutrality here. It's anti-racist. But how do you love the person who's spewing something that upsets you? That is very difficult. That's where I think interspirituality comes through. My background that Jasmine alluded to, I'm a retired Air Force chaplain. I took early retirement to become dean of students at the college where I had met my wife 20 years earlier. It's was a college for Christian Scientists. It's now opening its doors. Half its enrollment is international. It's still talking about spiritual things, but is working to translate so much of how it communicates those things. And so many things are changing today. A lot of people are saying, I have no religious background. Working with that young people as I have most of my life. In fact, one of you was talking about your activity with the Agape Center and Michael Beckwith. I spoke to their teen group at their international conference a few years back, and talking to young people who may or may not have had a religious background. These young people are just getting one. Some people don't have one today. Used to be an assumption that you could talk about, as most chaplains did at one point when I started in the late 70s, they would say your chaplain is your pastor in uniform. What does that say to somebody who doesn't know what a pastor is? It's a really different thing. And we talk about these people as, in the surveys that are done nationally, as the NONES, the nuns, no religious background. How do you spiritually minister to people who don't identify with a faith tradition? The other one, which is really interesting, are people who've been in a tradition all their lives and are now done with it. They're just checking out. They don't want anything more to do with the religious community. They're called the DONES, the duns. I've been there, I'm done with that. How do you help people, work with people, learn from people? And I think there's something powerful about how interspirituality, this connection to people and the universal concerns of what's my purpose? What's my unique calling about? Where do I find reconciliation? Where do I find forgiveness? How do I practice connecting to other people, to the planet, to the earth, to causes I'm concerned with, particularly when I'm disappointed? How do I rally? How do I find resilience? These are universal issues. And so I think it could be something that could support the good work you're doing and what it takes to stay in the fight. So many friends who went into social work kind of burned up and burned out. And if they don't find a way to water themselves, water their souls, they may find that a challenge. These days, and I was thinking about this week, the last 2 weeks, the challenges we see in the Middle East again. And I was thinking for me about an amazing year that I had as a chaplain here in LA from the spring of 1990 through the winter of 1991. You might remember what happened towards the end of 1989 as the Berlin Wall came down and the German Democratic Republic decriminalized one religion after another. And what it meant to see at that time the Cold War, which we thought was an intractable part of our universe. It was like we thought it would always be with us. We had no sense how it might end, especially short of violence and war. And so we had an Easter sunrise service that's done every year at the Hollywood Bowl. And I was here coordinating all religious broadcasting for the armed forces radio and television network, the largest broadcast service in the world at the time. Some of you might have seen Robin Williams in a movie called Good Morning Vietnam. His radio station was one of our franchises. And I was asked by the Hollywood Bowl people if I would host a segment of the sunrise service where we would be welcoming back representatives of the faith traditions that had been just recently made legal, be able to be public again in East Germany. And I did enjoy that so much, honoring these representatives here in America of traditions that had been outlawed in Germany. And then I told my church's own story. The list of these outlawed denominations were multiple, but the last one that the GDR, the East German government, made legal was the Church of Christ Scientists, the Christian Science Church. And then about just a matter of days later, the wall fell. But we were pretty euphoric in April at the sunrise service. It was an exciting time. We had great hopes for a new future, a world not governed by fear and war, cold or hot. That lasted about 4 months. It just is part of what we see in the human scene of how things can move so fast. On August 2nd of that year, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And there was a lot of concern. Iraq had one of the largest armies in the world with a lot of weapons they were believed to have, chemical, biological, and else, that were considered maybe making this war. It could have been a very difficult time for both Iraqis and Americans. So my ministry was to correct the great ignorance that a lot of people had about Islam and the parody, the caricature of Muslims that was going on at the time. Some it's going on still today. I first went out to try to find a television program we could put on our service that featured Muslims, by Muslims, about Muslims. There was one in LA on a cable channel, and I always have been drawn to people who break all the stereotypes. She's a Texas-born American woman, very stylishly dressed, very modestly, finishing her PhD in counseling. And she was co-hosting this television show that we got on our national network. And I appreciate the opportunity to have her come and speak at my broadcast center out near Burbank. It was a great, great time. And then speaking to our American troops, we weren't allowed to have religious broadcasting in the Gulf because of our Arab allies. They didn't want Christian or any type of religious messaging. So what are we going to do? Unlikely partners. That's the next part of this. So I'm approached by a representative of Southern California Christian music company called Maranatha Music. They have a history with Calvary Chapel. I mean, we're talking about conservative values here. And they offered to produce at their expense 100,000 audio cassettes. Remember those? Between 8 tracks and CDs, there were audio cassettes. And they were going to be distributed free to our troops using what was the way of music at the time. The boombox had defined Vietnam. Now, in this era, it was the personal Walkman. This was going to be a message and a design to speak spiritually to the souls of young troops. when they climbed into their sleeping bag and took their Walkman out and put the little buds over their ears, how would you speak to them? What would you say? And I was asked to be the consultant by the Armed Forces Chaplains Board, working with this group. And the first draft was an outstanding draft. It was 90% music. Wasn't going to be telling them a lot of truths or looking at a lot of faiths or telling them about faith. It was going to be asking them to experience faith. And I think that's become a big marker of where a lot of spirituality is. The woman of Samaria at the well did not want to hear a lecture about orthodoxy. She wanted to experience the acceptance and love that Jesus radiated, that Jesus didn't judge her, accepted her, saw her. Anyway, we want these young people to feel safe, to feel seen. And so I suggested using King David as one who had faced a lot, done a lot of what he was not proud of. And how did he deal with those things? So they came back with a beautiful, we worked on the script. It became a beautiful piece. We had 100,000 distributed of the cassettes called Desert Storm, I Will Be With You. And they were distributed in the Gulf, and they received so much appreciation. And it was an example to me of partnering with people who I might not agree with in their belief system, but I did agree with what they were trying to do. They didn't get a dime for this. That was the case with all the ministries that provided programming to us. They could not attack other groups. They could not use our service to build their mailing list. They had to make a genuine offering of love. And anyway, that was one powerful experience for me that led to a lot of others about how do you connect to people very different than yourselves. Maybe that's where peace begins. It isn't just the absence of conflict. It's the presence of security. And where do people feel secure? After this assignment, I went to Germany, Ramstein Air Force Base, our largest Air Force base in Europe, and was a senior Protestant chaplain. An issue came up about the Wiccans. I presume most of you are familiar with Wiccans, to be distinguished very importantly from Satanists. They're nothing to do with Satanists. They're simply natural worshipers of kind of what we would call Old English, pre-Christian belief systems and practices. They wanted a place to celebrate. And I knew some of our people wouldn't want them in our buildings. Also, United Press International was doing a story, looking for a story that somehow the military was going to deprive these service members of their right. And I didn't want that to happen. I invited them into one of our buildings, attended the first meeting myself, and the UPI reporter was there. There was no story. But it was also realizing that and standing up for them. I was standing up for all the people of any group that's felt misunderstood and alienated. And from a small Protestant group, sometimes not seen as Christian by other Christians, I could see that too. So by embracing all, that was a big part of my background. I've continued to make connections to people of backgrounds. When I got out of the military, I was dean of students at the college I mentioned. And a lot of that was changing old models of spiritual formation to get fresh ones, to be open, to be honest, less judgmental, to give things that looked like we were putting at risk standards of behavior. Not really. We were putting in better foundations for them. It was a rich time. And I continued after I left that after several years and started my nonprofit to broaden ourselves, to have connections with progressive Christians, progressive religious thinkers across the spectrum. These are people groups you may have heard of. emergent village, emergent Christianity, was very big in the 2010 to 2015, did a lot on the frontier of rethinking church doctrines and having interfaith activities that really weren't about representatives of denominational bodies, but were about finding commonness about how you could rethink old belief systems. We saw so many emerge. One woman I came to know was Phyllis Tickle. So you might have heard of her. Started the religious publishing group at Publishers International. Author of many books, an Episcopal laywoman. She talked about the U.S. and Western Europe in particular entering a once every 500 year change. That went back almost exactly to when Martin Luther nailed 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Chapel. It was a pretty powerful thing, as she would say, that it would change everything like it did 500 years ago. Not just religion, the Reformation changed politics, economics, everything. The Enlightenment grew out of it. And she told a group of clergy in St. Louis, I attended it, 250 clergy. This is an example of where the Spirit is blowing and what many people are calling this millennia an age of the Spirit, whereas a previous 100, 1,000, 500 years, 1,500 years would be called the age of beliefs. Now the age of Spirit. I saw Phyllis, a Tennessee grandmother, lean over the podium and talk to these folks without notes for 2 hours, go to lunch and come back and talk for another hour. And she just said to them, I got to tell you, I'm sorry I don't be the one to spread this, but you got to hear it. That doctrine of atonement you've been preaching, it ain't working. There's no way that an omniscient God can't figure out how to save you from your sin other than killing his own son. We don't need that kind of daddy. What great messages. What great messages. In 2011, Rob Bell, the pastor of a mega evangelical church, made the cover of Time magazine with his first book called Love Wins. His church was having an art show, and there was a picture of Gandhi that drew a lot of attention. And someone left a sticky on that portrait of Gandhi, which said, reality check, he's in hell. And Rob started thinking about that. I've met Rob, talked with Rob, and he said, really? He's in hell? And they know this? And his book, Love Wins, was featured on the cover with him of Time magazine 2011. And it basically destroyed the idea of hell. So you don't have a fear of going to hell. Some pastors felt if I don't tell them to fear hell, what would they come to church for? I know you all have some good ideas about that. Jerry, my wife, and I, she also has a Masters of Divinity degree, are involved right now down with the United Congregational Church of Irvine, the first open and affirming church in Orange County over 32 years ago, deeply involved in peace and justice issues. We love that. And I thought of what Rob did, and then another woman I'd met, she had a true trans-denominational church in Dallas, and she wrote a book called Original Blessing. And she basically tackled the idea of original sin, demolished it, as so many thinking pastors are doing today. It's original sin, which is sending people to hell. And if you get rid of both those, it opens the doors and the heart to consider how you could love, how you could care, how you could be renewed, how you could really see others more fully. It's an exciting time. But Phyllis was prophetic in this regard, Phyllis Tickle. she said that in the first 2 generations of every 500-year shift, and she could go back and do markers on those shifts, people were always more clear about what wasn't working in the status quo than what the replacement was going to be. So people today talk to me, ask me all the time. I've had a consulting business and with my nonprofit with different faith groups of all backgrounds. And they all want to know, how do we get young people to come to our church, our temple, our synagogue? It might well be that we're asking the wrong question, and that we may not be fully ready for a permanent answer. We just know what's not working. And how do we have conversations that are open about that? How do we make bridges to social agencies, psychologists, and do this kind of thing? One person who's done this beautifully is a Franciscan author and leader named Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R. Just out of curiosity, have some of you heard of him? Okay. Richard brought again, seemingly disparate things. Most religious leaders are, if they're on the forefront, are often either contemplatives or activists. I think we got an activist group here. Richard founded a group called the Center for Action and Contemplation. Minds are blowing. Most people can't see those 2 words in the same sentence, let alone the name of the organization. CAC.org. And in his most recent book, 2022, Jesus' Alternative Plan, the Sermon on the Mount Revisited, he writes something I think that speaks for our time. Reminds me of Abraham Kendi too. He says, bad people didn't kill Jesus. Jesus was killed by good people following conventional wisdom. That's where we are. Kendi talks about it as saying, again, the opposite of racist isn't not racist, as if that's okay now, I'm neutral. It is being anti-racist. And we work on behaviors more than we do names and brands. So I like the idea that there are people thinking today outside the box and bringing people together. I remember so many times when we thought we had people categorized in a box. And my Christian Science background, which I was asked to talk about, there are a few things I will say out of that religious experience that have really informed me in this journey. And I am glad, as just in examples I've been sharing, that there are others coming to larger conclusions. One of them takes a universal term to the Abrahamic faiths, that man, generically, the human, was created in the image of God, imago Dei. My Christian Science background gave me a lot more definition of what that would look like. It wasn't burdened by original sin. It wasn't to be driven by fear of a fiery, punishing death. No guilt, no shame. Evil was not a real power. It wasn't God-made. It functioned more like darkness, something that appeared in the absence of light and left in the presence of light. You might know scientists in physics and such, starting with the labs up in UC Berkeley back in a few decades ago, proved that there was no such thing as cold. There's not a natural state of cold. There's only the relative absence of heat. And that was helpful. That was helpful to begin to think about ideas differently. But I kept growing through this. I had to be willing to let go. In 1996, I was retiring from the chaplaincy, and I was sitting on the floor of my base housing in Florida with the movers were in the house packing out boxes for my family, my wife and 4 kids. We were going to move up to St. Louis. And I was on the floor with my typewriter. I wasn't even on a computer. Answering the request of the leadership of the college I was taking my new position of dean with. And they were asking me to write a defense of their stand against homosexuality. And I was trying to do a really good job, a caring job of it, not ever demonizing any person, but explain why we thought it was not good. We did away, and I wasn't grateful. There was a lot of doing away with hateful speech. I would say this. Sometimes I'm working with people with whom we radically disagree and may be tempted to think they're the problem. We might also listen to how they're moving, even if it's not far enough. Here's an example. There's a phrase that was current among what were seen to be at the time progressive Christians, not the radically progressive ones I came to know, but people who were trying. And the word was, don't hate the person, hate the sin. You hear that? That's not enough. That's not enough. But for some people, it had been a big step from where they were. And if you've ever played a sport or anything, you know, if you're in a readiness position to move in a sport, every sport, you're much more able to be successful. Same thing with if you're moving. If you can talk about something major in your life you've changed in the last 5 years, that's good readiness for what you might change in the next 5. So I got into this position. I went to the dean's job, and students at the college wasn't so much that they were mad at us. Sometimes they were, for our stand on homosexuality. And we really weren't even aware of the letters in those days, all the other letters. But they couldn't understand why we thought it was important. In some ways, it was harder to be irrelevant than it was to be opposed. They want to know why we were making such a big deal about it. And I began to learn that I was forfeiting the opportunity to have discussions and forums with them about how you love, because we were stuck on who they could love. I changed and became an ally. I was twice asked to give key remarks to the Christian Science LGBTQ community at their national gatherings. And I apologized publicly to my nonprofit board in front of them, to a young man who actually was a good friend, but had been a person that I hadn't given enough care to when I was dean, because repentance requires action, not just cessation of negative things, but practices of peace. I learned a lot through that. So if we do that with people, how can we do the same thing with somebody who advocates, for instance, a racist position? Can we separate what the person's saying from their deeper identity that they may have lost sight of if they ever knew it? Of what God is saying in them and through them and creating with them, of what God is calling them and each of us to in terms of being creative, of generative. The biblical thing to go forth, be fruitful and multiply, doesn't mean just have babies. It does mean make your life bless, be more than you and maybe the sum of you and your partner. But how do you do that when you're stuck on things that really upset us and peace in our society? It's a new opportunity. I think it's a powerful one, and one that I hope we don't get angry about. A lot of times we get angry in our work because we see the faces, we hear the voices of intractable resistance. and yet they aren't the enemy. The enemy is the lie. Jesus said that. Father of a lie, you are father, calling evil the father of a lie. And how do we get firm with that? How can we not be part of the problem, but part of the solution? I think those are really powerful ideas, but I'm going to let it pause here because I don't know how this is all falling on you, but I'd be happy to entertain any questions or viewpoints that you've drawn from all this, and if it sounds at all relevant.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very enlightening. How have you dealt with religion and technology and religions that a religiosity that is opposed to Christian Science or your beliefs, and you personally, how have you dealt with that, like on a racial level and on a how have you dealt with the resistance of both technology and racially in your experience? Thank you.
Well, let me take the religion one. I try to find, if they give me an idea, a religious belief, because that's kind of only one category these days of what the term faith means, including interfaith. It may mean an organization which has a bunch of beliefs that you've got to agree to become a member of. And then there's usually a structure to enforce purity. A lot of these things are purity cultures. So my question is usually back to them, telling me, I would ask them, tell me what that belief does for you in your daily walk and talk. How does it help you feel closer to God? Discover more about your true self and listen to them. And then we start talking about how do you feel closer to God? Then there's a different conversation than what do I believe about what you name him, or that his only utility was to be a lamb led to the slaughter, so his blood ransomed us. I don't want to dismiss that because that is what many believe. But today, clearly the weight is swinging in another direction, that there's more to Jesus than simply a ransom blood offering. And at least we could respect that it's affecting each of us. To your comment, hold a minute. To your comment about the technology, there's a case, we don't even know the questions yet, and they're going to change our. This author, some of you may have seen him before, on quantum super supremacy. This thought is changing the world. And what quantum computing will do, right now we have binary computing. It's going to be as ancient as an old 8-track is today. It's going to change everything. The speed by which we can respond to epidemics, immunology, the way we deal with calculating the weather. So many things are going to change, and religion needs to respond to that. Technology, you realize the debate between creationism and Darwinism is the debate between two 19th century worldviews. 19th century. We can do better, but we're going to have to let go of some of our presumptions. And one of them I'm seeing is that I think a lot of people are more interested today, including in my own denomination, much more open to how are things working. Used to be judgment upon whether you chose the right course of treatment, even for an emotional issue. But now the idea is, so how's it working for you? And 12-step and other programs have received a much more generous response from a lot of the people I'm seeing. And be honest and confessing, and now my wife and I are living in an over 55 community, which Jasmine has visited. So these are people who are thinking new, not all of them, but some of them are doing remarkably new things. So good questions. Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you. Dave?
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank Jasmine for bringing you into our circle. It was really, really good to hear from you, and I look forward to hearing more from you during this session. And you're in a unique position, or you were in a unique position until you retired, and I don't know if you ever retire, to be someone who brings faith to people, or more important, compassion and empathy to people in the military. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how the only books I really know are the Tanakh, which we call the Old Testament, and the New Testament. What they have to say to someone like you who enters the military. You enter to be a spiritual listener and a spiritual embracer, but you're entering an institution that makes war. So what did you have any thoughts when you did that, and what have you had any reflections since you did that? Obviously you've had a lot of thoughts and a lot of reflections on the meaning of being in the military and the meaning of being an instrument of faith.
Thank you. Thank you. When I mentioned all the fake prophets in the Jewish scriptures that were on the government payroll and not doing their job as prophets, there was one exception: Isaiah. Isaiah was on the government payroll and was faithful. So knowing there was an Isaiah, I could be faithful too. One example of what you're talking about that comes to my mind was I was the chaplain at the Air Force's Security Police Training Academy. These are the ones that protected the air base from intruders. And co-located with it at the time was the Marine Military Police School. And while I was in that job in Lebanon, somebody drove a truck full of explosives into the Marine barracks. You might remember that, I think 83. And a lot of recent graduates of our school were there. These are young kids. The group that goes into that often doesn't have the most sophisticated educational background. They have at their best a very pure intent to want to serve, to want to be useful. And the base community that where I was stationed in San Antonio was very concerned that these kids, seeing their friends having been killed, would start jumping, beating up the large number of Middle Eastern soldiers we had on our base learning English so they could go on for further schooling in defense matters. And we had an interfaith memorial service for the school. I led it because I was lead chaplain. And one of the things I did, again, pointing it back to the individual so that they wouldn't be cruising around in trucks after some beers and jumping people, which is, does this sound contemporary to what we're seeing today? If you're Palestinian or Jewish in a US city, you're a target. I just said, as we mourn the loss of your friends, please don't identify with the mindless violence that killed them. if you do, you're honoring those who did the violence, not your friends. And we never had any violence. That, I guess, has been my connection to try to do what you're talking about. I had the unusual experience. I was selected to go to Air War College for 10 months. This is the Air Force's senior school where they take the top 10% of the lieutenant colonels and basically train them to think like national security directors. It's to broaden their world. And they brought all kinds of theologians, ethicists in. It was always hard. Just your question is so on target. You know, when you're doing this work, the Catholic bishops had a doctrine at the time about nuclear war, that nuclear weapons could be possessed as a deterrent to someone using them, but that their use could never be morally justified. The conundrum here, I know if it's coming through, is if you think it's a deterrent, but you made a promise not to use them, it's not really a deterrent.
Right.
It's a really conundrum. And in War College, I had a lot of opportunities to have conversations. We were at the time doing a study for how space would look in 25 years. It's called Air Force 2020. And really a lot of the study was very prescient. It was back in 94, 95. And it was promising that the space would be occupied by individual entrepreneurs. Who could have imagined that? It was all government run back in the day. And they said it would look like the Wild West. And so that did become a point I grabbed onto. I said, because the Wild West was how all these individual actors would be competing in space. And my point in the discussion was, who's going to organize the barn raising in space? Because on the Wild West, there were also barn raisings. There was community, cooperation. We haven't quite got to that yet. International Space Station might be part of it. But it is a big question you're raising. But I think it's always helpful to have someone who can step outside the box. And the military, to its credit, gave us that position. In the Army and the Air Force, both, we are the only career field, the chaplain is the only career field that has its job put in front of its rank. I'm Chaplain Lieutenant Colonel Richard Davenport. It's inappropriate to call me by my rank in my professional capacity. And I always thought it was telling us something's more important here than your functionality as part of the machine. We need a voice outside. But if you're not part of the machine, you can't move with the machine. You can't go where the troops are. And anyway, that's my thought of very good questions.
Thank you. Very thought-provoking answers too. Carol Francis.
Yeah, thank you. Michikaku, I remember from the 80s as being a nuclear scientist who worked against nuclear power and nuclear weapons. I'm fascinated by your concept of millennium of spiritual as opposed to the past millennium of faith. That just blows me away. And thinking of people destroying arguments, like destroying the argument of a God that kills the sun in order to open the gates of heaven. How about God is a God of love? And omnipotent could do that anyway. I mean, that's so easy to knock out. Original sin. God is a God of justice, and yet some people like Mary is supposed to be exalted because she was born without original sin. How in the world do we praise somebody for how they were born or conceived? And or God gave the land of Israel, Palestine to the Jews. I'm sorry, but God is not a racist. I cannot believe God is a racist who says, I love these people. I made all these people, but I really love these people most. Excuse me, that doesn't. So how do you take those things? And they say, well, it says here in the Bible. And I said, well, it doesn't say that in the Quran. But the Bible's the truth, the Quran isn't. Where does it say that? Well, it says in the Bible, this is the truth. Well, I could write a book that says I was inspired by God. You know, sorry about the noise outside. There's this man near the corner that I walk past a lot, who Salvadoran or Mexican American, I don't know, has a boom box and a loud speaker. You can hear him for blocks away. You're forced to listen to this, preaching the word of Jesus, yelling into this. And I'm thinking, Jesus wouldn't do that. I mean, he's doing it in Spanish. My Spanish isn't good enough to understand what he's saying, but I'm sure he's not yelling, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth. You know, it's like, be a little more Christ-like. You know, Jesus wouldn't do that. So how do you approach people who, and do you have a clue as to how they become what they are, this obsession on yelling at people, you'll go to hell if you don't love Jesus, even though Jesus never said that?
Well, I try to reach back. I don't try to make them, quote, like me. I don't try to make them Christian Scientists. I've studied a lot of different religions, so I could find resources in their own religion that I could point them to. And you mentioned the Bible. The Jewish scriptures are, and the New Testament too, are not of one story. There's a lot in Jewish scripture that I would say even the majority report in Jewish scripture does show a favoritism towards Israel. But there were a lot of other voices there, including women. Ruth, as an example, that Micah, 2nd Isaiah, different voices that were talking about a more universal God, including the fact that at one point a Persian ruler is spoken of as a Messiah and a vehicle that God uses for the Jews. It began to point out all these things. Now, that doesn't mean that made it into the majority practice, but it does lay a groundwork for what Jesus tended to emphasize from Jewish scriptures. He didn't quote all the Jewish scriptures. He selected the ones that gave support to his universal inclusivity. And I love the newer Bible translations, New Testament in particular. The first public words of Jesus in Matthew, in most of the Old English, is repent ye. Well, repent almost has in our common usage a shame, a guilt. The better translations in more modern English is change your heart and mind. Here comes the kingdom of God. Not that the kingdom of God is somewhere future. That, in other words, that Jesus' message and his ethics are all relegated to the next life. Not what Jesus said. The kingdom's here and now. By the way, his cousin John the Baptist used the very same preaching message. Change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom. And I think that's really important. What he does is right around the Sermon on the Mount, right around the Beatitudes, Jesus deconstructs what the Jewish audience he's talking to has heard. The phrase we've often heard growing up from King James would have been, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. He does this 5 or 6 times. You've heard it said by who? by Moses. Really? In front of a Jewish audience, you want to take on Moses? Yeah, he did. He took on Moses about adultery, about a divorce, about a number of things. And it just shifted that Jesus wanted to have another conversation. But you're not going to win people by telling them that they have a wrong belief system. Asking for what they really are trying to practice. And the idea that we had for 1,500 years, from even 1800 maybe, from the Council of Nicaea up to 2000, a focus on, do you have the right beliefs? And we're competing with our beliefs. To thinking now about a larger vision. And that's the age of the Spirit. And the Spirit is not going to be confined in a box. People looking for religions today are looking for religion that supports their spiritual journey, not that confines it. In the church that we were involved in, I'll shout out to IUCC, there's no confession of faith to join. They want you to bring your faith, whatever it is, and find it nourished and supported there. It's remarkable. And we have to go back sometimes to the beginning. This is an interesting book. After Jesus, Before Christianity. It's by the West Star Institute, Hal Tusig, and a number of women, including a good friend of mine, Shirley Paulson, who's a Christian Scientist. But they have been involved in translating a lot of the non-canonical texts. And they basically tell a story of the first 300 years of following Jesus, where the term Christianity is not really in big play until after the Council of Nicaea, which was really Constantine, the emperor, wanting them to come together and have only one view of what being a Christian, following Jesus was. Up to that time, they had a lot of them. And then the decision just barely passed. There's a great book by Rubinstein called When Jesus Became God that tells that story, that unpacks that story. But what happened shortly after is, beyond just becoming legal, Constantine gave it the power of being the faith of the empire. And it was seen by him as something that could unify a morally bankrupt empire. And he marched his troops through the river as a baptism, that kind of thing. Anyway, then to just disagree with orthodoxy was criminal. And that continued for 1,700 years. It's a change right now to think about it. And back to some comments that were made, good comments about our experience as warriors with the church. We have things we could learn from Eastern Orthodoxy. The Eastern Church has a really different view of a lot of things that we could learn from. And one of the things that they did with their warriors returning from battle is they realized that they had been asked to do something debilitating spiritually. And before they could really resume the community, before they could take communion even again, there was a practice of reconciliation, how they could be forgiven, come to know themselves again, be received for doing what their society asked them to do. Maybe the lesser of evils, that can always be debated, but they did something to defend, that too could be debated. But I thought they at least recognized a dissonance that needed to be bridged. We could help soldiers do that. It's amazing. We just now, in recent decades, know what PTSD is and what a spiritual crisis it is. But what a great opportunity it is. And I've seen them. There's so many great models of how they're helping each other. We can't say it with just the male word right now, band of brothers. I call it band of siblings. Because the bond that forms between people, but I will say specifically among men don't form bonds very easily. They form shared activities, hobbies they pursue together. We bowl together, we fish together, we golf together. But women do so well what men find so difficult. But somehow they have found ways of being real and authentic and vulnerable and open with each other in dealing with this. That's a great step forward in faith. So that's my hope. We'll see more of that. And people coming back from conflict will have more resources than we ever had before. And we'll budget before we go to war how we're going to take care of people like our local translators, the indigenous people who help us in every country. We're going to write an exit plan for them. We're going to take care of how we're going to care for some of our wounded for a lifetime. It won't be an afterthought. And that'll hopefully help us raise the cost of going to war.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rick.
Richard, thank you for joining us. Jasmine, thank you for introducing us to Mr. Davenport. What struck me about your discussion is that I think that one of the things that we might want to think about is how, when it comes to interspirituality, is how our ideas about how we engage our own religious practice are not only shift with our understanding of the history of our own religion, but with the understanding of how social mores tend to change. Now we're talking century to century, right? And it struck me when you're talking about how the view in your religion about homosexuality, and this isn't just exclusive to your viewpoint in your religion, but I rarely see people talk about the evolving view of marriage in their own religious upbringing. Because if you were to think about a traditional Christian marriage, at that time that included chattel is part of what you were considered the family, right? So that would have been the amount of the slaves that you had. Also, the traditional religious family would have included more than one spouse, one wife. And we have evolved from that. And I think the reasons for that is not only the social mores, but the more we understand about the fallacy about true translation from generation to generation, the understanding that we have of the language barriers and problems that we have from trying to translate languages that maybe have a word for a specific idea that don't translate into what was then the King James Version of English at the time, or anything prior to that, or even after that. So I think in those instances, that can be the issue with bringing younger people into a religious view, because they don't see the issues with, for example, homosexuality, that somebody with a view of their own religious background might have some problems answering questions about, well, when are you going to get another wife? Or or anything like that. Well, how we focus on certain parts of our religious upbringing, some people could say based on our own neuroses or based on our own fears, right? And I think that's one thing that religious institutions have to think about, is that maybe before we go into ministering, maybe a lot of it has to do with ministering to ourselves and figuring out where our touch points and where our sensitive points are within our religious upbringing. I know that's more of a statement, but I don't know if that's something you want to
No.
address.
Thank you for that bridge. That's, Jesus talked in agrarian symbols because he had an agrarian audience. We have to work sometimes to understand what those symbols mean. And surely Jesus speaking today is not using 2,000-year-old metaphors. Hopefully, to Jasmine's earlier comments, he's talking about, let's talk about quantum computing, and how the Holy Spirit works in that regard. A symbol of the United Church of Christ, which is Irvine Church that we're involved with here locally. We're still involved with a very progressive Christian Science church we founded back in St. Louis. We're on the leadership team, my wife and I, but we do that by Zoom. In person, we're here with this church. But a symbol for the UCC denomination is a comma. I don't know if you've seen it, a comma. This afternoon, we're going to a comma group dinner. We're in a local comma group. The comma is to symbolize, don't put a period where God put a comma. God is still talking. So we aren't used to those old things. Your discussion, though, about marriage is key because, and by the way, I want to be clear, the Christian Science Church has changed radically its view on homosexuality. Here in this over 55 community, we have same-sex couples living together, men and women. It's not an issue, but we have changed. But part of the problem is in talking about homosexuality is we're so stunted in our discussion of heterosexuality. U.S. Treasury agents, how they're taught to identify counterfeit money. They don't study all the forms of counterfeit money. How many forms are there? Like how many wrong answers are there to 2 plus 2? There's an infinite number. Instead, they study the real thing. Then when they see anything that's at odds with that, they know it must be counterfeit. So we've never really gotten to that in Christianity very well. The message most of the people I've dealt with across Christian traditions, now I know that best, so I won't try and talk about Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or others, but in our tradition, the message a lot of young people have received is the church has 2 concerns about sex. Don't get involved with it before you're married, and after you're married, don't talk about it. We really don't want to hear about it. Get a conversation about sex after 50 and see if anyone really wants to hear about their mom and dad or their grandparents. It's mind-blowing, but it's an issue. And even down to the ground, there's one 20th century writer who was famous for his phrase that there's not a man knocking on the door of a brothel that isn't seeking God. We need to unpack that. What kind of union and connection beyond the chemicals of dopamine and all kinds of physical sensations? In fact, if we're going to talk about, I'll say the word, talk about orgasms. What is the word most frequently, the phrase most frequently seen in movies and depicted as at the exclamation verbally of the orgasmic experience? Oh God, oh God. Is that just happenstance? Or are we feeling something that's connecting us to something that's more transcendent, beyond our narrower, smaller world? Union with another person. What is union like with God? And celibacy is a great gift that a lot of writers can help us with. I don't think it makes a good mandatory gift, but as a chosen gift or life, it has things to teach all of us. And as we mature in faith, it may become even different for us at 60 than it was at 20. But we have to be open about this And young people feel pretty powerfully, man, if this church or religion can't talk to me about what's most important in my life right now, why am I hanging around? And until we can, we shouldn't challenge them for wanting to look elsewhere.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Sure.
That is a good research project too, to see what is the most commonly used word for that point in other languages.
In other languages. That's interesting.
Right? Because you would think with single, well, one or two syllables, it probably works. But in Russian, would you say Bogu? No, probably not. There's a research project there. I'll get funding.
I want to say one of the things that would help us is spending more time with the Jewish Testament. The Jewish view of sex is not challenged by our Greek Platonic orientation. They're very earthy. So earthy that the King James translators didn't know what to say about them. When Moses is said to have been so many years old and his vital energy was not diminished, the vital energy they're talking about is he didn't need Viagra. It's very blatant when the son of Solomon is coming down hard on the people about the tax burdens he's going to put on them. And he says, if you thought my father was hard on you, my little finger shall be greater than his whole body. That's not the digit he's talking about. I mean, this is earthiness, and we lose that when we get into this idea of the dichotomy of the material and the spirit and not having an integration there. The word was made flesh, was made perceptible to us where we are, who we are in our entirety. And now we're understanding it's way beyond one gender. In fact, the genderlessness of the discussion right now going on in sexuality is not unlike some of us the term that's being used is edge walkers. We walk on the edge between different communities, and we talk different languages according to who we're speaking with, trying to connect beyond the language to the experience that's common to all. I like that term, edge walker. I didn't come up with it, but thank you though. I know we got another hand up. I'll make sure everyone gets in here.
Mm-hmm.
So glad, Jasmine, that you brought him. He has jogged my memory from when I was a teenager, Air Force, all the way to Colorado, and to Leland Stewart bringing me into this, and then all the way to transgeneration. I mean, like, wow, this is what I'm about. And I'm so glad you came to us, because I know I'm on the right path here, especially the way that these young people are. And you know, and they're involved, and they really want to know what's true, and they really do want to do what's right. Yeah. You know, so I mean, like, thank you, Jasmine, again. When we talk about the interspirituality, we talk about I'm not sure, but when you say this edge walker, you know, but hey, the larger vision, and I think of when I was a child, I had so-called what was Methodist, but my mother was Muslim, and my father was with Ernest Holmes, and then she thought it was Christian, not Christian, but Scientology. My mother did. And took me to meet Ron L. Hubbard. And so when I was a teenager, I went and joined the Catholic Church because I liked my friends in the Catholic Church. And so I've just been in all different colors, all different nationalities. And I see this right now, that you are important, right? Exactly what you're doing. And I hope you stay as a part of this and as a part of us, you know, even on the board. We need you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. And I think we know each other, because I think we've crossed several pages.
We might have passed by. I've been to, you're at Agape, right?
Well, yeah, but before I was with the
Yeah.
Church Religious Science and with the Ministry of Prayer,
Oh,
International Metaphysical Ministries. Yeah.
you might have. Yeah. I appreciate that. And I appreciate your remarks.
And
It's
youth camp.
really, really, really kind. Thank you. I appreciate the interest in this. I think there's so much to explore here, and so many bridges to be made, and the future of the next. And I'll go ahead. I'll talk out the next millennium will be on the edge of learning languages we do not yet know. New tongues will be there to qualify how we can reason, how we can feel. And I'm really excited about it. I won't see it all, but I won't even probably see the biggest changes. But I know, here's one thought I've had. God has no grandchildren. God does not have to reach the next generation through us. God will speak directly to them, maybe in languages we don't even know yet. But that's my great hope. And people like Jasmine are part of that for me, my great hope.
Yes, 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 yes. And you too. You staying with us, okay?
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Because I see another youth camp, and youth and a thing, and then who bringing in people like Kelly, who has that generation, the TV show and everything, and bringing people in. I mean, hey, and then we've got another thing too, where they're going to different planets. So so it's not just about this Earth and being at peace. It's about planets and travel and science and just all this stuff. So hey, bring your buddies in too.
Thank you.
All right, Dave, your hand is up again.
Yeah, hi. By coincidence, or maybe not coincidence, we had a guest on our Friday forum about 3 weeks ago. The director of the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. And you may know him, Mikey Weinstein. And they represent, in many cases, very successfully, members of the military who feel that they are being evangelized and possibly excluded and oppressed by, let's say, Christian dominionists who believe that the military is a Christian force and that everyone in the military has to believe that they are carrying out a Christian mission. So, and the hotbed of that sentiment is the Air Force Academy. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of very oppressive evangelizing that has gone on at the academy. And so I wonder if you are familiar with that organization, Military Religious Freedom Foundation, its director, and what your thoughts would be about what I'm calling Christian dominionism within the military.
It's going to be a journey to work at that. I did watch, actually, when Rick sent me that some of your recent ones. That's the one I chose to watch a little bit of, get a little sense of what was speaking to. I've heard of his organization. I've been out of the military now since '96, so I've not been as current with it, but I know the academy issue very well. There were a number of young cadets who were feeling like the junior officers, in particular, lieutenants and captains, who were the ones who were their instructors and squadron leaders, sometimes were putting pressure on them to participate in these conservative evangelical forums. And being in Colorado Springs, it's interesting. The Navigators Fellowship, the Officers Christian Fellowship are all headquartered there. A lot going on in Colorado Springs. And I think they did want to stand up for it. One thing they did is they replaced the chaplain who was the head chaplain at the Cadet Chapel, the beautiful building that's kind of the landmark photo for the academy, replaced him. And an effort to say change is going to happen, it's going to be real. They actually picked a Christian Science chaplain to become the new head of the Cadet Chapel. I thought that's kind of interesting because it's kind of reaching way off to a minority group. We only had 3 or 4 of us at the time in the Air Force chaplaincy. And I think people are looking for a new design. But it is interesting. We're going to continue to do what we know how to do. And these people will, you remember the old line that Henry Ford had when he was asked about what people were looking for. He said, at one point, at least he's reported to have said, if you ask most people what they would like to get around in, they would tell you a new model of horse. That's what they knew. And I think people are going to go back. They're going to retreat back into the familiar. In fact, one of the authors, Kathy Escobar, talks about faith shift, the idea of moving from one religion to another, or one state of faith, generic, to another state. And the fact is that people often move and then they will recycle back, because when they reach a challenging point, an uncertain point, a point of liminal point, not clear what exactly they should do, they will revert back to where they had surety, where things were clear. And it's not all, it is sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But the status here, she's got a marvelous recovery church called The Refuge in North Denver. But I think it's something everybody's going to have to journey with, but it's going to be hard because the conservatives are large enough in some of their organizations to go through denial about the diminishing numbers. They will report the size of their new groups as diminishing, but they still look like there are a lot of people around, and there's a lot of surety. And in their faith statement, they're not sure that faith isn't synonymous with certainty and control. They want to be in control. And a lot of the faith journey says you're surrendering control. You're not supposed to control God, persuade God, sell God, steer God, or know what God's going to manifest. But Abraham never got to see a video of the promised land. He didn't know what he's walking to. He never has a great understanding of God, only that God was real to him. And that becomes the rock that people come back to. So I'm hoping they would come to respect how real God is to people whose beliefs might be different than those. But right now it's important that they have those, they feel fear, a lot of fear. And I'll say this maybe because I think I'm coming to the end here. The way of dealing with fear is love. 1 John 4 says, perfect fear casts out love. He who's fearing is not made perfect in love. And there's a book called Stages of Faith, came out just when I was graduating college, was big in my seminary days, called Stages of Faith by James Fowler. He does for stage development and taxonomies what Piaget did for educational taxonomies and Kohlberg did for moral taxonomies. And the highest stage of faith, and it's present in every major religion represented in interfaith, the highest stage of faith is loving without thought of return. Loving without thought of return. Love of this sort is not, it's not about trying to make things work your way. In Christian Science, Mrs. Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, a congregational woman, who wanted one of her last major acts before it passed at 89 after hitting flack all her life for being a female, daring to be a spiritual leader, founded the Christian Science Monitor, which got its reputation for injuring no man but blessing all mankind, of universal love. But she said, love is never poured forth vainly, even though it meet no return. And we have to make sure it's not a transactional thing that I employ to get my wife, my kids, my church leader, my community, my adversary to be what I want them to be. I will say this, when you're looking to build bridges, you probably already know this, one of the places where the bridge building is happening is where the edges are of each tradition. Look to the mystic traditions. I think in Islam, for instance, Hafez and Rumi have had huge audiences among all kinds of people. And I'm reading stuff right now from Teresa of Avila, Hildegard, a number of others, women who were out there exploring these themes of divine love. Which again, Mrs. Eddy would talk about as being the central point of her teaching. Her problem became that when she started to teach people in her day, a lot of them didn't get it. So she developed a metaphysical system, which was only supposed to be a bridge to having a more complete saturation of divine love in their life. And women in particular have been leading point on this for a long time. And now when we talk about divine love experiences, now we're in a big river. We've got out of our little creek, you know, the type of creek where you're in an inner tube floating down, but you can touch both sides. You're in total control. You're in total control. And now you're saying, no, you got to let go, let God, and you got to come out in the big river. And all of a sudden you're not special, but you know, you're not a unique group with the truth, but you're out there now with everybody flowing home to the heart of God. And I love that we feel ourselves out there and we have different conversations, different practices. And that's my great hope, my great love and joy as was being here with you all today. Thank you.